Hi folks, welcome. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes, so you'll be able to just watch us as we do our preliminary preparations. And we welcome you if you're online streaming. I'm not sure which camera is on me, but we'll start in about 2 minutes. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and be ready to start. Let's do it. Well, we'd like to start for the folks who are here and the folks who are watching. We appreciate you being here. This is just a couple words of introduction. This is the first of a 3-part series, so if you found this to be meaningful, by all means, tell your friends and invite them. I think these are important conversations that we're having. The series is entitled, How Do We Talk About Israel? And in the fall, we're going to talk about the 2 series are How Do We Talk About Israel to the Outside World, and How Do We Speak About Israel to the Next Generation, two separate programs. Today is How Do We Talk About Israel Among Ourselves, which is equally challenging. I want to just give a shout out to 2 people who helped me put this together. Richard Hirschat unfortunately can't be here. He's from AJC. He is not feeling well this evening, and he decided it's better for him not to be here with us, given what all the things are going around. And of course, Michelle Bider-Stone from Hartman Institute, who's here with us. She's the LA director of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And the 3 of us, Richard and Michelle and I, have been collaborators over a number of programs over the past several years, especially during COVID, to put together programs that really reflect our institutional values. And I'm grateful for the partnership, for sure. You've heard the expression, and it's so trite and commonplace that it doesn't even need to be said, but 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And it's been something we've held up as a hallmark and a source of pride for the Jewish community. The Talmud famously preserves the debate. Hillel and Shammai are notable for honoring each other's contrasting opinions. And even the Bible itself, read very carefully, is full of differences in opinions that span hundreds of years. So we have a legacy of rich and robust dissent. Despite that, when it comes to Israel, things get very complicated. To borrow from our panelist, there he is, Dov Waxman's book, There's Trouble in the Tribe. And so rather than seeing this discord about Israel as a source of strength and perhaps even intellectual rigor, we lament it as some kind of a crack in the armor of the Jewish people. Perhaps we accuse the other side of it's reflective of moral failings on one side or another, or worse, we say it's dangerous to Israel's existence, this trouble in the tribe, or even the integrity of the American Jewish community. So ironically, though, and this is also from Dr. Waxman's book, most of the surveys out about the American Jewish community actually reveal that the level of engagement is quite high, perhaps even higher than it's ever been in Israel's history, which is really quite astounding. So rather than lament what we don't have and seek to return to an era that at best is either more of a fantasy than a reality or only existed for a short amount of time, with this 3-part series, what we're doing is really exploring how we can go forward given our new reality, which has been in existence for some 40 years almost in terms of the dissent, the growing dissent. So on behalf of AJC, on behalf of the Hartman Institute, on behalf of Stephen Weiss Temple, I am pleased to welcome Dov Waxman, who is the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. He's a professor of political science, and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA, and he's author of several books on this very topic. Masua Sagiv is the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and she's a scholar in residence for the Bay Area for the Shalom Hartman Institute. And in Israel, she's a researcher at the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University on their Faculty of Law. Joining them in dialogue, I am pleased to invite and welcome my colleague, Rabbi Sari Laufer. You have cards, or there are cards outside if you'd like to grab them for your questions, and I'll be collecting them during the program. If you're watching us online and you want to pitch a question, please send your question to my email. I'll be monitoring my phone. It is ronstern@wisela.org, R-O-N-S-T-E-R-N, Ron Stern, at wisela.org. And if I get a question from you, I'll be sure to try to pitch it to our participants. So without any further ado, please.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you both for being here. I will say we got to have a prep call now quite a while ago. When I dug up my notes, I was like, yes. And I could tell just from the call, I think we'll get to mostly just sit and learn as all of you will, because I think there's lots to be said by our experts. So I'm going to start, I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to start with a very easy, we would call it a softball question here, though I guess I'd have to change that for both of these cultures. Well, Israel's got baseball. I don't know cricket or soccer, football, right?
Soccer.
We call it soccer. Yeah. But I'm going to start with, I think, in some ways, the broadest question, and one that may or may not have an answer. And so I'm going to sort of start with you, and then we'll include everyone. Talk to us a little about the whole notion of the Israeli project. Like, what is the Israeli project? And I think, in terms of this conversation, who's included in that project? And then we'll come to the next part of that question.
Okay, small question.
I said, we'll start easy.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So let's start. Israel has 3 commitments that it declares. The first commitment is a commitment that it has as every sovereign state, the commitment towards its citizens. Now, Israeli citizens are combined of approximately 79% Jews and approximately 21% Arabs, or Arab Palestinians. So that's the first commitment. The second commitment is a commitment that Israel says in its constitutional text that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. So Israel has a commitment towards the Jewish people. And the third commitment Israel has is towards human beings as human beings, because being a democratic and a liberal state, and maybe also being a Jewish state, Israel has commitments towards people and aiding those in need. These 3 commitments, when they conflict, raise the tension of what is the Israeli project and what should take precedence, right? Precedence over the other. So I would say definitely Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, but I would also say that there is a growing sense or notion of a growing Israeliness, which is different than being just a Jewish and democratic state. Maybe we'll talk more soon about what that Israeliness is or could be.
So I have 2 follow-ups, and I think you'll jump in here. So one is around those tensions that you talked about, or when they come into conflict, and I'm curious, and maybe this is where we talk about that Israeliness, and I think both of you from your academic lens, like what happens, especially now, right, with a growing non-Jewish population of Israelis, to that tension between the responsibility or the declaration is to my citizens, and the declaration is as the nation state of the Jewish people. Talk to me a little bit about that conflict and how it plays out.
Do you want to come in, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can.
You jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that there is these multiple commitments. I think there's a clear hierarchy, though, in my view, in terms of how the kind of projects, if you will. I think the Zionist project, Israel as a state, from the outset has been committed to the Zionist project, to being the nation state of the Jewish people, to national self-determination for Jews. I think the Israel project has been not only less central, but actually in some ways suppressed. As in, there has been the emergence, the growth, the development of Israeliness, the sense of a commitment, of a project that includes all Israeli citizens, I think has always been not only secondary, but sometimes actually kind of repressed actively. And I think what we're seeing in recent years, there is this emerging Israeliness and demands for the state to represent all its citizens, you're seeing actually an entrenchment of the Zionist project in Israel, of Israel's identity as a Jewish state. And the nation state basic law that was passed in 2018, I think is the most clear manifestation of that. So to my mind, I think, the Israeli project it's happening in Israeli society, but it's not happening with the support of the Israeli state or government.
It's interesting. A few months ago, I think, I was invited to a panel discussion that the panel was supposed to be when Israel's future constitution will be written, because Israel doesn't have a constitution. Now, it won't happen, but when the future constitution will be written, who should be around the table? And I was invited to talk about the role of world Jewry. And after talking and saying my spiel, everyone attacked me, like right and left wing. Everyone were talking about the Israeli project. Now, I completely agree with you. It's something relatively newish, and we can see trends. And I also don't think that so the Israeli project can be based on the most basic level is needs, right? Like needs that every state should supply to its citizens. Hospital, healthcare, I'm sorry. Services. The second level is, as I see it, shared destiny. It was manifested a few weeks ago in one of the terrorist attacks in Bnei Brak. So a police officer that tried to counter the terrorist and got killed, Amir Khouri, was a Christian Arab, a Christian Palestinian Arab from the north. His fiancée was Jewish. He saved a lot of people. Hundreds of ultra-Orthodox came to his funeral talking about unity, and the city of Bnei Brak is commemorating a street after him. In a Christian funeral and all this. So there is something in the shared suffering.
Exactly.
But we don't have the next level.
Yeah, I think it's critically important for Israel's future to develop that. We saw, almost exactly a year ago in the kind of sectarian violence and the intercommunal violence that took place between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, the risks of not having an Israeli, with the fact that there isn't that kind of civic tie, and I think that's absolutely essential, but it raises a fundamental question, which I think does pertain to Jews outside of Israel, which is, what is the purpose of the state of Israel? Who does it serve? Who should it serve primarily? Now, even though I'm a Jew living in the diaspora and have strong attachment to Israel, it enriches my life in many ways, I'm of the opinion that it should serve, that Israel's purpose, first and foremost, must be to serve its own citizens. That the needs of Israeli citizens and the importance of establishing that civic framework in Israel, to my mind, should take priority over the needs of Jews outside of Israel. That Jews in the diaspora cannot cannot ensure the survival of their own identity at the expense of Israel's flourishing. which is to say that Israel, first and foremost, needs to prioritize the needs of its citizens. And while, Jews outside of Israel have a voice and should have a voice, I think I think the idea that, Israel is there for our purposes is misguided.
But here is where is it okay?
Go.
Sorry, so here is my concern or question or what I struggle with. I know that it's important that Israel, takes into precedence the needs of its own citizens. It's really important. But I also know that Israel needs to be the Jewish state, the state of the Jews, the state of the Jewish people. Now, what happens, or let me phrase it otherwise, how does this affect how we understand Zionism today? Because I feel like Zionism was very clear before we had a state.
Right, what's that great quote, right? Zionism is one person asking another person to give money to a third person to bring something to Israel, right? Like there was a whole...
That's American Zionism.
Right, that was American Zionism.
Yes,
I think that's true.
No, but I know,
Free state.
I mean, we knew that it had two main jobs, right? The first more urgent, but it had two main jobs. So the survival of the Jewish people and the cultural prosperity and spirituality of the Jewish people. Now we have a state, and we actually have we have two centers. The Daniel Hartman calls it from no home to two homes. And I think it raises the tension between the Jewish peoplehood piece and the Israeliness piece does raise the question of the role of Zionism today or the content of Zionism today.
So I would ask two things, which you might be about to answer anyway, right? One is, I am hearing and feeling this tension between, I think, what we think of as the Zionist project, right? Building Israel as the Jewish homeland or, the state of the Jewish people. However, I think there's lots of language around that. And this idea of there's also this Israeli project. And so I'd be curious sort of to hear some reflections. And this is, I admit, this is quite provincial and sort of American narcissism, right? To talk about the American Jewish role in either or both of those projects, right? Because it feels like they're maybe not one and the same. Maybe they never were. But certainly now it feels like we're at a time when they're not necessarily one and the same. I mean, you can add other diaspora communities, but...
I think, so I think there is a kind of fundamental uncertainty about what is the purpose of Zionism in Israel and what does Zionism mean for Jews outside of Israel in the 21st century. Now, I've always been drawn particularly to the Ahad Hayam cultural Zionism, and so which is to say that one thing I see already happening is the ways in which Jews outside of Israel, what's happening in Israel, the cultural productions, the Israeli culture, Hebrew language culture, is enriching Jewish life in the diaspora, as Ahad Ha'am and other cultural Zionists imagine. You don't necessarily need a government to be doing that, right? So in other words, you have a very thriving, large Jewish community in Israel, either the largest or the second largest, depending on how you count who's a Jew, but it's a very large Jewish community, and I think what we're seeing increasingly through the consumption of Israeli culture is actually that is enriching Jewish life far from Israel in ways that don't necessitate the government, so to speak. So I think there's when we think about we think about Israel and Israel's value, we often collapse into that both Israeli society, the government, and the state apparatus as if it's one and the same. And I think actually we can say, that there's a lot that Israeli Jewish society, which is so dynamic and diverse, can do, which fulfills a kind of Zionism insofar as it's a source of Jewish identity and survival of the Jewish people, without necessarily having every government see its primary role as serving the Jewish people. And just, an example, I mean, I just take something a bit political, but I saw like former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just made a statement yesterday, I think it was, saying that, the budget deficit in Israel is because the money being spent on Arabs. As if money being spent on Arabs, Arab citizens of Israel, is somehow illegitimate. That the role of the government should not be allocating money to be spent on Israel's Arab citizens. That's the kind of thinking that I think is problematic. So I think, we can think about Zionism not just in like, what should the Israeli government be doing, but rather have a much fuller understanding of Israel, and that in many ways, it's, in my experience personally, it's actually the interaction with Israeli society, with Israelis, and of all walks of life, that for Jews outside of Israel is actually the most enriching. It's just being where a society where the majority are Jews, the majority of people, and where there's a Jewish culture and calendar, and Jewish culture suffuses life in every way. That, for many Jews in the diaspora who go to Israel, that is the most powerful experience of suddenly being where your culture is not, marginal or like brought out like this month, Jewish Heritage Month, is like suddenly, but not tokenized.
Which we have to share with a couple of other months.
Right,
so.
which they have to share, but actually not tokenized, but actually in that, and that, I think, in many ways, it's a different kind of Zionism than the one that's been emphasized, which is focused on the role of the government and the state. But to my mind, that is actually the most sustainable, and for many Jews outside of Israel, what's most enriching. It's not, we don't necessarily need the government investing in this element. It's actually just getting to know Israeli society and Israeli Jewish society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want me to talk about the American piece or the?
Go for it.
So when you were talking, I was actually thinking about the flip coin, because the flip side of the coin, because when we're thinking about Israeliness and we're thinking about culture and society, we are seeing something that is actually kind of similar to what the Jewish community in North America had for the past decades of living. I mean, it's true that we have the Jewish majority, which is great because it makes Israelis feel, or Jewish Israelis, feel very secure and feel very safe culturally. I'm not talking about personal security, but the ongoing integration between, 20% of society is not few, is doing something that here is being done for decades. It's living side by side and knowing different cultures in a way that does not threaten your own culture. And I actually, last year during the May War, I personally encountered something that was very new for me. Although it was very difficult. I mean, I have family members in mixed cities that were frightened to get out, to leave the house to buy bread. But on every social circle that I had, and that was the first, someone told me they reached out to a fellow Palestinian citizen of the state. Just, not to talk about the content of things because it was too emotional, just saying, I'm thinking about you. Are you okay? And that's it. And I feel like that's something, I think that we have something to learn from each other. And I think that's something that in the American society is very present. And in Israel is just starting to be present. So I agree with you about the focus on society and not only the government in this sense.
So now my question sort of around the Israel diaspora, I think that we spent, as evidence tonight, people are joining us from home. People will watch later. If you had driven up here, 3 weeks ago for Yom Ha'atzmaut, it's, you would think you were in Tel Aviv with the number of flags and such, right? And as your book says, right, Israel is still an enormous part of American, and I actually think diaspora Jewish identity. I'm fairly comfortable saying that. And so now I'm going to switch from the Israeli project maybe back to the Zionist project, right? what is the role of diaspora Jewry in Israeli Jewish identity, Israeli Jewish discourse? Like, do Israeli Jews talk about the diaspora as much as we, I think, talk about at least Israel, if not Israeli citizens?
Not as much, that's for sure. I'm going to take your cue and we'll separate between government and society.
Right.
So government, in the first decades of Israel, Jews outside of Israel were either potential victims or potential immigrants, like olim to Israel. That perception is changing. It's not over, it's not done with, but it's changing. And actually, the 2018 Basic Law of the Nation State reflects that Israel understands that there are thriving Jewish communities outside of Israel, and it's actually Israel's role to help these communities be strong and prosperous. On the other hand, in the same Basic Law, Israel doesn't feel secure enough to have the relationship be mutual. So Israel doesn't feel yet in its governmental activities, it doesn't feel yet like like world Jewry has anything that it can contribute to. It's a whole different matter in civil society. In civil society, there is a growing notion of Jewish peoplehood. There are growing more and more initiatives of meeting and of understanding. I mean, religious feminism in Israel is completely following American religious feminism and other movements that focus on Jewish renewal are drawing on these movements, the Reform, the conservative, modern Orthodox movements in the United States, in North America, I should say. We're not there yet, though. I mean, there is a strong resistance in Israeli society. I think it's because I think Israelis feel like they are constantly being criticized. Maybe we'll talk about criticism more soon, but I'm really interested to see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that certainly I don't think Israeli Jews spend much time thinking about, Jews in the diaspora or concerned with what they're talking about. I think it's not just a reaction to the criticism. I think Zionism, classical Zionism, was built upon this idea of the shalalat ha-galut, negation of the diaspora, and this notion that somehow Jewish life in the diaspora is inferior, that Jews in the diaspora are kind of weak, timid folk, afraid to stand up for themselves, that somehow they aren't even real Jews or full Jews. And this isn't just a view held by, the Orthodox or Israelis. I mean, this is held by secular Israeli Jews as well. Now, I think there's been some shift over the decades away from that, but that's deeply embedded, and it's hard to give up. And there's part of the reason I think it's hard to give up is because life in Israel can be hard. I mean, it's not easy. You serve in the army, you have to do reserve duty. So the belief, the notion to hold on to the belief that this is where Jews should be, this is where the Jewish future is ensured, I think is important for Jews in Israel to therefore deal with the hardships and the sacrifices that they have to face. So I think so much as there's all of this emphasis upon this partnership and how Jews in the diaspora should be. Well, I think it's deeply rooted in Israeli culture, in Zionism, and in Israeli Jewish identity. Yeah. This sense of kind of superiority, if you like, and out of superiority. If you feel you're superior in some ways, then you're not really going to be very interested in something that's inferior to you. It doesn't really have anything to teach you. That is shifting, and I think there is beginning, at least among those who are the most exposed to American Jewish life, that there's an openness to that. But I think it's unlikely to really change. And, I can understand as a Jew in the diaspora that can be kind of upsetting to realize that actually, your Israeli friends actually kind of think, well, what right do you have to say this? And you're not really, you're kind of a cowardly Jew or weak diaspora Jew. But as I said, to me, I see that in ways as necessary to deal with what Israeli Jews have to deal with.
It's either that or saying, why would you come to Israel to new immigrants, right? To Olim. Why would you come to Israel? Why would you leave your comfortable lives? It's
There's that as well,
it's a
yes.
conflict. But I also think politics has a lot to do with it. The fact that the Jewish community mostly in the United States and the Jewish community in Israel are mirror images in politics, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that that Israeli Jews are very militant and very feeling superiority, if to use your words. And I honestly think that I look at how Israeli Jews perceived of former President Trump. I think that if the political opinions were different, it would be much easier in today's world. I'm not talking about ideology, but in today's world, I think it would be so much easier for Israeli Jews to be in alignment with American Jews.
Yeah, I agree. But even when there was less distance politically between the two communities, and American Jews strongly supported Israel and didn't criticize it, there was still the attitude of like, well, who are you to? So I think it is deeply embedded in the kind of Israeli Jewish psyche, in at least in the ways in which Zionism has been expressed.
Yeah.
And I think, conversely, many Jews in the diaspora have internalized that as well. They have internalized that sense of inferiority. Who are we to say? And I think so. That's not a healthy dialogue, to the extent that there is even a dialogue where one is feeling slightly inadequate and apologetic because they're not, living in Israel or serving in the IDF or doing these things, and the other is looking down on. And I think that part...
And jealousy.
Yeah, and also...
At the same time.
Exactly, in the same time, jealousy. And so it is a difficult kind of emotional mix that's going on. And I think it's better to acknowledge it than just, avoid it or blame it all on, the politics of the day. Mm-hmm. Yes, politics matter, but I think there's a kind of a deeper cultural attitude in the construction of Jewish identity in the United States and the construction of Jewish identity in Israel.
There's two directions I want to go. So I'm going to go in one, and then I think we'll be able to come back to the other. I'm sort of... I think underlying both of those directions for me is this question of what is appropriate American/diaspora engagement with, conversation about Israel, right? That's my overarching question, and so I'm like, that's where is the big picture. The two things I'm thinking about, one are, that shift that you've both sort of alluded to or said explicitly of, when the Zionist project started, right? It was a funding relationship, right? I am gonna help, settle the Jewish homeland from afar, and that sort of potential victim, potential olah. But I'm gonna settle from afar, and as Israel has become self-sufficient, right, that automatically changes that dynamic. And so how does that play out? And the other side of it is, we actually had Noah Tishby here, she's a parent here, and we were talking on Friday about how you cannot be Jewish in the public sphere, period, without an opinion on Israel, whether or not you want to, right? Like you could say, wow, the sky is blue today, and someone's gonna be like, either like blue like the Israeli flag, or like, how dare you bring up, Israel, and so there is this assumption and that intertwining of the Zionist project, the Israeli project, and diaspora Jewry, right? The world sees that as one and the same. So now I turn to you with this big question of like, so what does the appropriate engagement look like? What is the just answer it for us. Just give us the answer and we will do as you say.
It's very simple. You just had to ask us. Now you'll know all the solutions, right?
Perfect.
I mean, I guess it partly depends on what's the purpose of the engagement, right? Like, I think for American Jews and Jews in other countries, Israel is a huge part of Jewish identity and Jewish life, and sometimes you're forced to confront and deal with Israel or talk about it even when you don't want to. So the purpose of Israel engagement for Jews outside of Israel is primarily for their own purposes. In other words, it's not to, in my view, necessarily because the Israeli government or Israeli Jews are going to listen or pay attention, let alone do what we might want them to do. It's primarily because Israel is important to us. Israel, what happens in Israel affects us much more than Israelis sometimes appreciate. It affects us here. And therefore, we need to figure out a way to engage with Israel and talk about it in a way that is not destructive of our own communities or undermining our own sense of security here. So in other words, the purpose of our engagement is basically for us, for our own internal purposes. And that's different for Israelis. So I kind of see, there is this inevitable relationship, but for the most part, the ways in which we talk about Israel and engage with Israel, really the question we should be asking is not, is it good for Israel, but is it good for us? Because that's the primary role that it's playing, is that it has been for so long the kind of glue that has held Jewish communities together in the diaspora, the thing that has defined Jewish identity, and we have to figure out a way of managing that at a time where Israel and its policies, its government's policies, are becoming increasingly divisive. And that's about our own needs, not about Israel's future. I mean, I care deeply about Israel's future, but that's primarily because I care about what happens to people in Israel. So I think there are somewhat separate issues in that respect.
So, first of all, Israel is not self-sufficient yet. Not really. That's the first. Second, the wrong mode of engagement is not to engage. So I know that the understanding that it's so complicated can sometimes cause people to say, okay, I can't talk about Israel. In my daughter's middle school, they were learning about Zionist thinkers, and the discussion in class started and then continued about whether Israel should have been established or not, and whether it only kills Palestinians. And the really amazing school that my kid go to didn't really know what to do, and it didn't have the educational tools, in a sense. I mean, it did. It's broadcasted, right? But it struggled.
Send it to them.
But it struggled. It genuinely struggled, and then turned to people who that's their profession to see how to talk about Israel, because it's not easy. Something that was maybe easy a few decades ago is not easy today. But the first thing is not to engage is not the solution. Now, I want to add to your point, and actually saying that as an Israeli, I also have a stake in Jewish Americans' engagement in Israel, because Israel defines itself as a Jewish and democratic state. Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. And we have several options of what that Jewish is. It can be the state of the Jews, just demographic, can be national, can be religious, and it can be cultural. I think that it also, the way that Israel defines itself as a Jewish state has an influence over Judaism itself. And I think a dialogue between the two largest Jewish communities today is crucial for Israel's Jewish identity, for the development of Judaism, and for that reason, my gut is telling me to urge, American Jewry not to desert us, in a sense that, not just to think on your own communities, which is super important, and I acknowledge that, but also to recognize that the engagement also influences Israel's Jewish identity, which is right now in a fierce struggle between liberalism and liberal and conservative powers.
No, I completely agree. I think that engagement is important for the future of Israel. And in terms of what that looks like within the Jewish community, I think the existing model, if you can call it that, the one that has been, that's dominated communal life for decades, is clearly bankrupt, which is...
Don't mind me.
Which is to say that, the idea of shielding people from the realities of Israel and constructing and believing that particularly, children, adolescents, youth cannot handle that they have to be somehow fed or this fantasy of Israel, because that's how you get them to be attached to Israel, and that attachment would not survive a confrontation with the messy realities of life. I think, that's not working. Every year I teach courses on Israel, and every time I do so, I meet with Jewish students, Jewish American students, who will say, I didn't learn, I never heard anything about this, I didn't know this is really upsetting. I was at a day school, not these people who were experts, they thought they had some knowledge, and what they've realized is what they were told isn't necessarily complete fabrication, but is really a very idealized, the kind of Israel of Exodus, the novel, not the... And so that's not working. That model is not working. It's broken down. I think it's clear that there needs to be a shift. I think at least there's a recognition of that, but there's a lot of trepidation and a lot of fear and anxiety about actually moving to embracing a different model of engagement, which I would call kind of critical engagement. I term this in my book. Which is to say, it allows for another term that's, Macomb uses, hugging and wrestling. It's not based upon this idealized. It's actually one that, sees Israel as any society, as any country, with its flaws, with its problems, with its challenges, and at least demands engagement, not walking away. That's the one thing you I think can insist upon, that you don't just walk away. Even in your angriest moments, you continue to wrestle, you continue to have a relationship. That's the only thing I ask of people, just not to be apathetic. Even if you're completely strongly critical, that's a relationship, you're engaging. But apathy is, to me, the end of that engagement. So I think we need to move to that. But I think there's a lot of resistance, partly because people don't really know how to do that. No. And, there's still this sense in some quarters that if you can just repeat the same mantras enough, that somehow, you'll get a different outcome.
Israel will change.
Yeah, Israel will change, or that
or
people
American
will be,
Jews.
or American Jews will change. And I think we have to accept the fact that we are in a period, we've entered a period, and it's not going to change, where there is criticism, where there is dissent, where there are going to be very different views about Israel, about its governments, its policies, its history. And instead of trying to suppress that debate or exclude those views, we have to be able to find a way to accommodate that within the Jewish community.
The political philosopher Michael Walzer distinguishes two types of a social critic: the connected social critic and the independent social critic. So the independent social critic is looking on a society from the outside, and they have no stake the society, and they judge it on characteristics of universal values, values that are not part of the society. Whereas the connected critic, which that we also see in Israel's in ancient Israel's prophets, have stakes in the community. They see themselves as part of the community. They share their values. They care about the society's future. I really welcome this age that you're calling the critical age. I really welcome it. I fear that I wonder how the American Jewish community can be the connected critic rather than the independent critic. I think it is possible, but I also think it's a challenge. And I think people's ears are less open to the independent critic. It's not that the connected critic has a great time. I mean, the prophets weren't really popular. But still, I feel like, I feel it a lot as a center left-wing person myself. I encounter here in academia a lot of, and my fellow colleagues are a lot of the times, they would put me at the same box. There's only one category of Israel. There's only one Israel. There are no diverse people inside it or diverse political opinions. There's only one option to being Israeli. And that's really hard.
Yeah, I think, this kind of brings up the question of how should you criticize and who has the right to do so. And I agree. I think as Jews, it's important to if you want to criticize, if you feel the need to criticize, to do so as a connected critic, as a sense of, this isn't just I'm criticizing another country and another country's government, and but these are having a sense of this is my people, basically, and now it's not always easy to express that in a criticism, in an op-ed or a tweet, and that's part of the problem. It's very difficult sometimes. I find this difficult sometimes to convey that or to modulate that in public of how to express, on the one hand, that this criticism is coming from a place of deep care and solidarity. But I think that's necessary. But I think if one of the requirements of being a connected critic is for Jews outside of Israel is that they're allowed to do that.
Yep.
Otherwise, if they feel that there is no place for criticism in the organized Jewish community, or they're being silenced or marginalized, then they become the disconnected critic. And I think that's the danger. The danger, particularly for younger Jews today, is that if they feel that there isn't a space within the Jewish community for criticism and dissent, then they'll leave it altogether.
There's also a growing disconnect. Sorry.
No, go.
There's also a growing disconnect between. So some organizations would talk in the name of Judaism, not in the name of Jewish community or Jewish people. And I feel like this is a category which is important because, of course, people shouldn't be marginalized and feel as though their criticism has no role and has no place. I think I said before. I think that Jewish American criticism is crucial for Israel's Jewish identity. Democratic identity is also. I know we're not in a great place democratically, but I think the Jewish identity is in real trouble right now in Israel, even though we have a prosperous culture and all that. But it has to be from the category of Jewish peoplehood and not from the category of just Judaism, I think.
So, I'm thinking about this critical engagement, and I think about the framework of critical friends, right? Look, I think one of our challenges, again, societally writ large, is the lack of nuance, right? And I think that the American Jewish community, and I think, certainly, I think the Israeli government often really tries to paint the American Jewish community as you're either pro-Israel or anti-Israel, and there's nothing in between. And I always try to talk to students and be like, no, I need you to spend time with Israelis, because if you want to meet people who are able to criticize, like the breadth of that conversation in Israel, I feel like is so lost here. But I am curious, and I know we're going to have a conversation in the fall that's really focused on sort of the younger generation, which I know is a concern. It comes up here. We had, again, on Friday, parents who said, my kid came to me when they got to high school or they got to college and felt like they were unprepared for the conversation. But I am curious, like, in this sort of critical engagement, who is invited to the table, right? Are there organizations or ideologies that are sort of, so I'll go with red line, not green line for tonight, but, that are over the line. And, I think especially with, I don't think it's actually this huge majority. I think it gets a lot of press, but like the language of anti-Zionist Jews, right? Like, how does that all fit? How does that fit into this framework of, are they connected or are they disconnected?
So this is one of the biggest questions that I think in Jewish life today, especially as the kind of numbers of Jews who are questioning or critical of Zionism is growing. So I'm a pluralist when it comes to this question of who should be, or what organizations or individuals should be included in the conversation. I think we should have a really open tent, if you like, that is as inclusive as possible. I think, so for me, the red line, if you like, isn't your position on Zionism, even though I know that is for many organizations and for many people. I think the red line is your solidarity with the Jewish people. How about Israel? That, if somebody says, look, I oppose the idea, if somebody says, I oppose Israel's definition as a Jewish state, I oppose Zionism full stop, but I worry and I care about Jews in Israel, and I care about their future and their well-being, and I think having a binational state is better. I mean, whether I agree with it or not is a different matter. But if they come at it from that point of view, then I feel okay. They should be included. If their view is, I couldn't care less about Jews in Israel, right? I only care about the oppressed Palestinians, right? Right. In other words, some organizations define themselves as Palestinian solidarity groups. Fine. That's fine, but they're Palestinian solidarity groups. If you're coming at it from a commitment, not necessarily to the state of Israel, but a commitment to the Jewish people, to Jewish peoplehood, then for me, that merits inclusion. And I think actually, not only normatively is that desirable to be as inclusive as possible, but practically speaking, I think the idea of now imposing a kind of ideological litmus test, like for organizations or individuals, that you have to subscribe to Zionism, and specifically political Zionism, not other forms of Zionism, and there are others. But that idea is actually going to drive away a lot of people, and is going to become, because we are entering a period in which I think, for a whole variety of reasons, the unchallenged dominance of Zionism in the American Jewish community, which has not always been the case, it's something that emerged in recent decades, is changing. It's losing that dominance. It's shifting in American society at large. And so I think there is going to be a growing trend of either non-Zionism or even anti-Zionism. How we, those of us who identify as Zionists, respond to that is going to be critical. We're either going to be spending the next decades having sectarian conflict within the Jewish community, ideological, do you subscribe to these things? Do you once say this? Or we accept the fact that, political Zionism is not identical to what it is to be a Jew, that many of us believe that it's been a great thing for the Jewish people, but as I said, as long as you're committed to Jewish peoplehood and the well-being of the Jewish people, to my mind, that trumps support for any political ideology.
So I completely agree, although, I mean, solidarity is also kind of a litmus test.
Not an ideological one.
Not an ideological
yeah.
one, yes, but still an emotional one.
Yeah.
I'll just add two things. The first is, I don't believe that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, as some argued. And I'm all for sitting with everyone around the table and talking. I will say it is a matter of concern, the fact that it is more and more challenging to be a Zionist in American Jewish society today. And even if you don't declare yourself a Zionist, but people conceive that you're a Zionist, I have examples from the Bay Area, and I have examples from New York, and I'm sure there are other examples as well. People are losing cooperations, and people are losing coalitions because they refuse to denounce their Zionism. So yes, definitely being pluralistic about who we are talking to, but we're also, I mean, this is not a clean-cut, or I'd say differently, this is not an academic debate where I feel very comfortable in. If people are expressing their solidarity, then I would love to talk with them. I would, but I also see trends in society and within organizations that make me concerned.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, just as it's wrong to exclude non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, it's equally wrong to exclude Zionists. And I agree. I think I think the real challenge in the United States is for liberal Zionism, because that's particularly in crisis, I think, as a result of the collapse of the peace process and the seeming impossibility of a two-state solution, and all of these factors is really challenged, particularly liberal Zionism. I mean, I think illiberal Zionism is doing pretty well. So it's really the liberal version that's. But I do think in wider American society, absolutely the tendency now in some places to think of Zionism as a byword for racism, oppression, is really problematic. I mean, I'm, as you already guessed, coming from the UK, and that's been the case for a while in the UK, that people say Zionism is, like it's a dirty word. So I think it's incumbent upon Zionists to explain what their Zionism means. But I also think, part of the problem is that the meaning of Zionism over the decades has become narrowed to support for the state of Israel, which has in turn become narrowed to support for the Israeli government's policies. And we need to actually distinguish not only between support for the policies of a particular government and the support for the state of Israel, but also support for the state of Israel and Zionism and different varieties of Zionism. So I think, the future of Zionism depends on broadening out people's understanding of what that means, as well as pushing back strongly on these claims that somehow Zionism equals, just as it's simplistic and facile to claim that anti-Zionism equals X, it's also facile to say that Zionism equals X.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, of course, we're getting into the good stuff, but I'm also getting the sign that we're going to start wrapping up. I wanted to check, Rabbi Stern, if we have any questions. Well, I should ask if we have any questions here, or any that have come in before we. Well, why don't you, because you have the mic.
Sorry. Oh, goodness. It seems Israel maintains full support among American Orthodox Jews. Why is it that Israel is having trouble with progressive...
can't understand.
It's too fast.
Okay, sorry. Okay, is I going too fast?
Yeah, you want me to read it?
It seems that Israel maintains and I'm not going to editorialize, I'll just read what's written. Israel maintains full support among American Orthodox Jews. Why is it that Israel is having trouble with progressive Jews and even middle-of-the-road Jews? What is it that the Orthodox and progressives disagree on, and what do they agree on, if anything? It's a big question. I think. I'm not sure if we can do that.
I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to turn it to you.
You want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that this is, it's not, I don't think it's solely an issue with non-Orthodox Jews. I mean, even among Orthodox, I think there are some shifts taking place within modern Orthodoxy, but I agree that it is primarily an issue between non-Orthodox. And I think, I mean, there are many reasons as to why that is. I think a part of it is that the non-Orthodox forms of Judaism are liberal. There is a liberalism that is at the core of American Judaism and the Jewish identity, and it's not just political liberalism. That liberalism is part of American Judaism, about American Jewish identity, and that is in tension, increasingly in tension, with trends in Israel, both within, whether it be Israeli Judaism in terms of the dominance of the ultra-Orthodox and the exclusion or marginalization of liberal forms of Judaism, but also in terms of government policies towards Palestinians and other areas. So I think there is, I think for many liberal Jews, non-Orthodox Jews around the world, this is an issue. And it's becoming more of an issue over time. I already mentioned how liberal Zionism, which was the form of Zionism that appealed to those Jews, is the form of Zionism that is most in crisis today. Other forms of Zionism are, thriving. But liberal Zionism, the belief that Israel could be simultaneously, Jewish, democratic, two-state solution, all of these kinds of beliefs are much more under threat today, challenged by events that are happening, by trends that are happening. And so, I think it is a problem. But I don't think it's one that, that you can say, oh, well, you can just write off liberal or non-Orthodox Jews, as I think Israel's previous prime minister might have wanted to do, because ultimately the 90% of American Jews are non-Orthodox. And that, and the idea that somehow Israel could only depend upon the support of Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians, I think in the long run is a big risk for Israel, not to mention for the American Jewish community, but I think it would be a narrowing of the political basis of support for Israel in the United States.
And the Jewish identity, as
and
we
the
said
Jewish
before.
identity.
The old version of Israel's former prime minister actually embraced liberal streams in the Jewish communities in America. The newer version, and I think it corresponds with political trends that we see around the world of populism and the rise of the deteriorating of democracies around the world. By the way, France, Hungary. We see trends like this around the world, not just in Israel and not just in the United States. But Israel establishes Orthodox Judaism as its established religion. This is the first and foremost answer to the question why it's easier for Orthodox to feel connection to Israel than to Reform and than to the liberal streams. And also the notion inside the liberal streams of freedom and equality, which are the basis for also the American notion of what the goal of the state is something that highly contradicts both religion and state matters in Israel, and obviously the occupation of the Palestinians, and also equality of Arab Palestinians that are citizens of the state inside Israel. I do think these trends there are trends to both sides, right? So there is the last government, which I'm saying for the past month, I'm saying it's probably in its last days, but then it still continues on and on. I don't know, but the current government is doing some serious changes, both in matters of Judaism and state, or religion and state, if you will, the relationship with world Jewry, and trends inside society, mainly a Palestinian party, a first-time Arab Palestinian party is part of the government. So I think that there are pulling trends, and on the other hand, you see growing trends of the other kinds of Zionism that you were talking about.
But I agree with you. I mean, ironically, you know, the period from in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when liberal Jews, you know, saw in Israel a reflection of their liberal values was actually a fantasy. Actually, in some ways, Israel has actually become more liberal since then. I mean, but you know, at least certainly economically, but even in terms of the role of the state and you mentioned before about trends in Israeli Judaism. So it's funny. I mean, the Jewish liberal Jews, liberal religious Jews, and political liberal religious go together. See in Israel now an increasing it moving in against their values, whether it's their Jewishness or their broader liberalism. But ironically, actually, in some ways, it's in some aspects. And again, that I return to the comment I made before. If you focus not just on what governments are doing, I mean, this is part of the problem, is that most people from abroad look at Israel and they see Israel from what the Israeli government is doing. But if you look at what's happening in Israeli society, then actually you have a slightly different picture. And that's why I think it's so important that the engagement needs to be not just focused on the government and the politics, but on the society, because there you can see, if you're a liberal, you know, non-Orthodox liberal American Jew, you can find within that in Israel. You can see these developments happening. And look, it's not like the United States is exactly this great liberal utopia, you know. So
What are
we're
you
used to.
talking about?
Liberals are used to having this sense. I mean, this is a transnational issue. It's not American is a blue state and Israel is a red state. No, America is divided and Israel is divided.
Also, there are trends of universalism and particularism in liberal streams versus Orthodox.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we're not talking
I'm
about that
told.
now.
Yeah, I would love to pitch the next question, but I think we've gone over
I was going to say,
time.
I have a lot to say as a rabbi, not an academic, about the religious underpinnings also of Orthodox Zionism, but I'll leave that for another time. And I think, first I want to thank you both. I really could have sat here for like much longer and kind of want to, but I'll let you go home. You have a flight to catch. We need to, you know, get you back on the 405. Who knows what the traffic is. But what I will say is, I just want to thank you both. You know, when I teach about Talmud, forget teaching Talmud, right? One of the things I say is that I think our rabbis really love to set up sort of black and white opposites, right? This is kosher, this is not, you know, this is allowed, this is not, this is pure, this is not. And yet, actually, most of our religious tradition exists in between. And I think we are in a society that also is really trying both, again, the broader society and the Jewish, right, trying to say, like, you are either for or against, you are, you know, Zionist or not. And I just really want to thank you for letting us spend this time together in the gray, like in the in-between, because I think that's where the growth is. And certainly I feel like that's the part that gives me hope. So thank you both. Thank you all. Thank you at home.
Thank you.
Thank you.